Hi everyone. Video 29, controversy warning. What is mainstream society? In the last video I was talking about video games, which is pretty much as mainstream as you can get these days. Something I've been looking at all my life, in fact, because I was the first generation to have Pong on the Binatone console, followed by the Atari cartridge system, before even the first home computers appeared from Amstrad and Apple Macintosh. This is back in the early 1980s, and since then I have seen them develop complex storylines and eventually overtake the cinematic film industry financially and as a source of ideas. With all the investment and technology and staff, the video game industry now shares even the most famous voice actors with the film industry, like Mark Hamill and Giancarlo Esposito, having moved from basic games like shooting asteroids to more advanced and lifelike storylines, and using actors in cutscenes, using CGI and cinematic effects to create the type of experience found in movies, and hence the interactive entertainment industry has for some time been examining the great mysteries of life, how the world works, issues like fate, the divine plan, and whether or not we are simply making it up as we go along. So, in general, mainstream society has come to the point where it is questioning itself, which we can see as an evolution in philosophy, which has come through the postmodern age into the multipolar environment, and has become even more of an issue due to the use of data gathered by computers and used by governments and corporate analysts. In this video, I said I'd be talking about where the world went from the point when the United States started taking down the Iranian nuclear program, which it primed earlier by pulling out of the nuclear deal it had with Iran in 2018. So going back to the idea of how we got to being where we are, in terms of the causality inherent in the situation, that is how it has once again arisen out of what we now call history. Having established the relationship between NATO and BRICS evolved out of the Cold War relationship between the West and the Soviet Union, hence leading to the Ukraine war. Then the Israel and Gaza conflict appears to have been caused by Russia advising Hamas, who didn't know that there was a music festival there, distracting media attention from the war in Ukraine. Then this being used by Israel and the US to complete its war on terror objective of attacking Iran. All this monkey behaviour justified by the fact that we're still officially living in the Holocene age. So perhaps this is why governments are largely ignoring the whole idea of both climate change and the Anthropocene, as they need to have all this crazy stuff going on, so they can save the world from the nuclear device which they developed themselves. Meanwhile, Russia has shielded itself from the issue in domestic terms by calling the war in Ukraine a special military operation. But it does make me wonder what type of deals the superpowers are making between themselves, and whether or not it points to the need, or rather the ability, for the UN Security Council to reform. Like I said previously, the current situation favours the Uniting for Consent movement over the G4 nations, which want to put themselves in charge, as we clearly need proper analysis of the situation before any action can be realistically proposed. So people need to find out what is going on, as the UN has complained itself about its own paralysis over the issue. Then it may be a case of admitting countries on the grounds of regional representation to monitor situations within their own vicinity and raise issues with the Council in a general sense, with a new set of rules on how to take action, as we can see ourselves getting on top of the situation in this way while we are stuck with our present model. This would be a clear step towards progress from the problem that we've had with the Cold War, then terrorism, then the multipolar phase, and the ongoings of which many governments have had to hide, or at least lacked an explanation for, meaning we need to get the situation into a more manageable form. Then it may well be Germany, India, Brazil, Japan, or even Nigeria or South Africa, which get permanent seats on the UNSC, which would still have the ability to appoint nations as non-permanent members as needs arose. Owing to the situation which exists now being all over the news, it's going to be very difficult for the existing Big Five to hide what has happened from the general public. For example, it was just the Glastonbury Music Festival last weekend in the UK, and this means big money for the organisers, but it also means very controversial acts. But I don't think we've had a double criminal investigation before, which I'm sure you'll see is purely circumstantial, as no actual acts of terrorism actually occurred. Yet the UK government is launching out on this one because of the side they're on in the Middle Eastern conflict. Criticising Russia for prohibiting free speech, the UK and the US, in fact, are being drawn into exactly this type of behaviour, all because the structure of postmodern society and the age that we live in. The Conservative Party anthem is Jerusalem. So how can they pull out of it? This is why the rise of the Anthropocene makes a shift to a more objective perspective, not just reform to the Security Council. But people need to be shown the general proportions in which things are evolving to actually see the big picture. Think about the problem Russia has before October the 7th. If nothing is done, Israel does not freak out and attack Hamas and Hezbollah, which are both backed by Iran. So Iran doesn't retaliate, and the US can't attack the nuclear program in Iran, so the situation can't move forward. In other words, the world has come to rely on the games that are played between the superpowers to move forward, or else it just simply won't. Or it will, but in a way which is not predictable, according to the patterns we've seen emerging out of history through the Cold War, etc. The one which seems to make sense to governments because of the context of the postmodern age and the relationship between nations. Because of the asymmetric nature of the situation which exists between the deep divide within left and right in politics, this is the direction in which Western politicians can claim to be winning, while those on the BRIC sides can say that they are winning too. But maybe we should see it's not all about winning. Maybe it's more about taking part and how you play the game. After all, where is the referee right now? People are being killed in these conflicts, and all leaders can worry about is their own popularity. The UN is paralysed because it's its own system that created the situation, which in itself is not raising the issue of reforms which the world needs. It is the continued problem of fighting between East and West, represented by left and right, because of how the situation has evolved, when we should be healing the division. This must be done using facts, logic, and proper argument, but we still have terrorist attacks emerging out of the situation on all sides, because the world is attacking the problem rather than solving it. This is why we have seen so many alerts over the last few years about the possibility that every move we make might trigger World War III. Still, there are some people who have vested interests who will argue against changing the way things are. People are already trained for the job of running our current world. Vast intelligent agencies have funding. Governments have established strategies for managing public opinion. The educated, the music, the film industries can follow the situation and develop long-term plans for themselves. But ultimately, they can't control evolution, as it is a process which evolves out of nature and not a religious text or a political ideology. So many things seem to be working in an absurd way right now. I mean, take this Irish band, Kneecap, for example, who played at Glastonbury and are now facing a criminal investigation by the British government. So, okay, they're rowdy and rude about the establishment, especially the UK government. Having never heard of them before, from what I was reading on the BBC News website, I thought they were going to be a bunch of yobs. But it turns out they're actually quite intelligent and have some interesting things to say, ones which raise major questions about corruption within governments, and especially in the UK. It is thus not surprising that the BBC has attempted to distort their social influence. For example, they said at least with Nazi Germany after World War II, they had to face up to it and change. But the British never did. They never had to. This is an interesting point, one which the British government doesn't seem to be able to handle. Notably, their act was not live screened from Glastonbury by the BBC. However, the rapper Bob Vylan was, and he had crowds chanting "Free Palestine" and "Death to the IDF," meaning the Israeli Defence Force. This is directly inflammatory and against UK laws. So Britain in recent years, though, has been accused of two-tier policing, where they will tolerate this kind of language from Islamic extremists, but not from its own citizens, which have been told to follow its traditional way of life, and a new political ideology of conformism and enforced gentrification of the working classes has emerged around it. But the issue, which has been posted on social media extensively, is that the bombing of civilians and deliberate shooting of children in Gaza is not a problem, but the fact that people are talking about it is. And on top of this, the peaceful protest Free Palestine organisation has recently been banned in the UK on the grounds of terrorism for breaking into a Royal Air Force base and spraying red on 2 of their helicopters. From Fatima Al-Kassab at NPR News, London, the BBC said that they should have been quicker to stop the live airing of the Bob Dylan performance, saying it was categorically anti-Semitic. But this is not necessarily true, because it was just criticism of the current Israeli regime, whereas anti-Semitism is directed against Jewish people in particular and the broader Hebrew community in general. Anti-Semitism attacks the Hebrew character, and this was referring to a particular incident. But despite this, there will be no shows for Bob Dylan in the US, as US Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landay wrote on X that the band would have their visas revoked. The Scratch and Jen have pulled out of the Manchester Radar Festival because Bob Dylan has been dropped. British police said in a statement that a criminal investigation has been launched over the Bob Dylan and Kneecap performances, including for possible hate crimes. Bob Dylan shared a statement on Instagram after his performance in which he said, "Teaching our children to speak up for the change they want and need is the only way that we can make the world a better place. I said what I said," end of quote. The BBC also issued a statement to say there were 7 acts at Glastonbury they deemed to be high risk and said would make immediate changes to live streaming music events so that any music performances deemed too high risk by the BBC will now not be broadcast or streamed live in the future. So maybe we should be asking the question as to what mainstream society actually is. Is it one which allows protests or prohibits it? Or can it simply vary its policies to adapt to changing circumstances? This means that the world is not moving forward in terms of establishing better living conditions and human rights, but however governments deem fit. More fundamentally, though, is it the progression in Judeo-Christian society which created the nations of Europe and then took over the Americas, creating modern capitalism, and then communism emerged as the radical antithesis, while claiming to be the final phase of history, then the BRICS alliance emerging out of the Cold War, leading to a new synthesis of ideas in the centre ground? Or is it the world which created nations in their entirety and religions, including Hinduism, Islam and Christianity, as what is mainstream in one place is not normal in another? So is the idea that people have of mainstream moving from life within nations to being more about understanding the pattern which runs through history and thus acknowledging the authenticity, or at least the legitimacy, of communist countries as having the right to self-determination, aside from what the West has created as a world economy in the period from around 16 to 1900, before its collapse into World War I and II. This would make sense of the fact that we are thinking more globally than when we entered the multipolar phase. However, some people are just still thinking that everything that exists for them exists within their own nation, despite having multiple wars between nations. But we can never go back to how things were, just because some people can't resolve their differences. Realists may consider that there is no rational argument which will cause the superpowers to stop because of the momentum in the world system, and many places are doing just fine. But should everyone else have to pay for the wars in places on the other side of the world? It would seem, according to the superpower logic, that the whole situation must now be manipulated into enabling China to take over Taiwan, thus reabsorbing the nationalist element which communism has lacked, which they have now realised is essentially part of themselves and something they need to maintain stability. This brings us to the question over how are they actually going to do this, and it would seem that resolving the fundamental nature of the divide between right and left in China will mean the whole world will make a huge step in that direction, which points to the whole new phase which needs to come after the war on terror eventually ends with whatever happens to Iran. As it does not seem logical that we're going to be able to solve the whole problem all at once, but if you break it down into sections, it looks like the whole plan for global politics would appear to have to go like this in stages, even though it's strange to think that some people already know what popular music people will be singing on their way to work in China as the situation moves forward into an age of more harmony in terms of politics. And this is all being enabled by the compartmentalization and control of politics and intelligence agencies. But it all seems perfectly normal to the people in the government departments whose job it is to deal with this and manage people's everyday lives, like the analysts and negotiators, and the way that their departments communicate and coordinate themselves with oversight from senior operatives while think tanks come up with new ideas. Hence, it may be a thing within nations, not just the big five superpowers, which involves measuring the way ideas go around the world's political circuits. Given the alliances and treaties between nations, which is officially used for monitoring purposes, and most people don't know about its application in politics, even though Edward Snowden went a long way towards describing how governments were gathering information on people, he did not entirely explain what they were using it for in terms of the big picture. For decades, governments have been letting people know that they've been running surveillance programs and campaigns to influence political opinions and social behavior as part of politics, but not how controlling the actual direction of global affairs goes, with the superpowers coordinating themselves at the big five Security Council meetings and then coming back to their own people and telling them about how terrible the enemy is. So it's even created, as far back as the 1960s, for example, characters like the Mysterons from the television series Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, who come from the planet without a heart, which is presumably an analogy for what happens when governments use their powers indiscriminately. So if we can talk about how the structure of the age is evolving in this sense, then we can see governments are adapting and certain ideas will be used to carry us over. But the new period has to emerge as something in its own right and not just as an extension of the world of the past, which we know to be dysfunctional. But only the people who understand the difference between the Holocene and the Anthropocene will actually know what is supposed to be changing, and hence how to bring the change through. Too fast and it becomes unstable, isolated pockets of change. Too slow and there's stagnation, cultural rebellions and riots. However, this also shows the world within superpower politics as something of a fragmented jet stream of ideas, as discrepancies between their responsibilities for their own nations and other areas of the planet will continue to cause certain things to be omitted or neglected by politics, while other situations will be dealt with as important and forcefully moved forward at the expense of other issues. And governments may have to reveal exactly what their reasons are for acting in various ways. It seems inevitable that government departments will find out in their own ways about how the situation in which the superpowers have come to work, like Ukraine war came to balance the war on terror in the Middle East, and explains how superpowers justify things and hide the inevitable deaths and dazzling errors which come with such high-profile situations, which appears to be the cause of oppositions like Navalny, for example, becoming somewhat naive martyrs. So it would seem, if only people would see what's really happening, then we could all get mathematically on the same page and discuss what type of united consensus might be for the direction of global society and get the ball rolling towards reform to its institutions, and all find a direction for ourselves within this. This will mean people will have to go beyond their immediate responsibilities and understand the world of the superpowers, rather than just watch the situation evolve from within their own national comfort zones. To stop thinking in such a purely dualistic manner in terms of what does or does not lie within their borders because of how the world needs to move forward from where it is today.